Well, while Alyssa is getting our technology in order, just a little bit more background about myself. So like Alyssa mentioned, I work for the National Wildlife Federation. That's my day job, but I also farm part-time in Wisconsin. So some of the policy ideas that I'm going to be talking about here today basically translate from some of my experiences of farming and watching my neighbors farm right across the road sometimes, and oftentimes just shaking my head and wondering why are we rewarding this? So I'm just going to dive right in. Let me just first set the stage and set the context a little bit, and then I'll drill down as we go along here. We're in a changing context, quite honestly. We can't think about policy operating within its own sphere without considering this context. I'll give you an example. So growing consumer demand. A number of surveys now show that 80% or more of all consumers out there will make purchasing decisions based on sustainability. They want this. And a very simple correlation here to the policy front is they're also taxpayers. And so they're going to want that in how they spend their taxpayer dollars. And so that's just part of what we're going to have to realize. And some people get it and others don't, and we're going to have to help those who don't get it to get it, because it's reality. Second context I want us to think about as we frame this up is the growing water quality and environmental issues. So I don't think I really have to go into detail on that. We're all familiar with if it's the Mississippi River, if it's Lake Erie, if it's 45% of all water bodies in Minnesota that don't meet swimming or fishing standards. You name it, you name a state, you name a location, there will be some sort of water quality or environmental issue. And we've talked about climate change, we've talked about carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat. It's a long laundry list, and it's ever present. Perhaps the third component that I'd like us to think about as we look at policy and what we want to do with that going into the future is to think about the next generation of farmers. And we're all familiar with this big generational shift. The average age of a farmer right now is around 58, 59. Considerable interest to move that next generation in, to make sure that there's room for them, to make sure that there's an opportunity for them to make money in farming, and to make sure that they can farm in a way that supports a good quality lifestyle. Here's one component again. They're very much a product of their generation, and the next generation coming up has a considerable interest in ensuring that not only is the environment cared for, but that they themselves individually are participating in caring for that environment. And not just in some sort of offhand, I'm going to send a check to my favorite foundation or organization for $20 a month. They want to participate in this. So if we want to ensure that there are ample farmers, not just an opportunity for farmers, but the next generation wants to come back to farming, they need to see farming as having an opportunity to influence and to live out those values. So I think that is significant for us in so many ways, not just in terms of policy itself and not just in terms of the environment and water quality, but in terms of what sort of farming we would like to see into the future. If we want the next generation there, it has to be a farming system that they want to get into. And I'm going to be honest, I have friends and family, and I'm getting to that point now, they're younger than me, that are looking into farming, and they have some doubts. And they're seeing the cost, they're seeing the returns, and they're seeing what it does to the land, and they have some big concerns. So I think we can get there, though. So one more little background here. I'll give you just a few more examples. So many times when we make farm policy, it's in its own little sphere. And then when we make water quality policy, then we have state level policy and local policy. They're all just operating independently. And much like we've heard from so many speakers and the farmers that we've heard over the last day and a half, that is the exact opposite of systems thinking. And not unlike farming, we have to have a systems approach when it comes to understanding policy. And so we have to keep this in mind as well when we're thinking about our farm policy. So, give you an example here. In 2011, water utilities spent $4.8 billion, that's billion with a B, in removing nitrate from drinking water supplies. That's a substantial portion and almost equal to the amount of money that we spend on conservation. And so if we think about the ramifications, what can we do with that 6 or 7 billion that we spend on conservation? Can we ramp that up? And it actually accounts for savings elsewhere. And granted, we're talking about different accounts, but we as taxpayers should all be concerned because it eventually comes out of our pocketbook one way or another, right? Another example of this issue of balancing in separate spheres of policy is, again, looking at unintended consequences. We have a lot of research efforts and information dissemination efforts to boost production. Note I didn't necessarily say profitability, but to boost production. Even Wisconsin itself has its 30 by 20 program. We want to get 30 billion pounds of milk by 2020. I don't know why, that's just it's a great round number, right? Makes sense. Okay, we've been on that track for a few years, and now we have farmers losing their contracts to ship milk. We also are seeing a record number of farm foreclosures, the biggest rate since the 1980s. So what is that doing for us as an interest and as an agricultural sector? And thirdly, and I'm going to start digging into this issue in particular, when it comes to crop insurance, we may have risks managed, but not necessarily reduced. We may get a check, but what does that do for us long term for managing our risks? In full disclosure, I have crop insurance, I buy crop insurance. And so I'm going to make this up front. Crop insurance is important. It's a useful tool for managing risk, and one that we should not think we should just get rid of. It's there for a reason, it serves a lot of purposes. And at the same time, it perhaps has a lot of opportunity for better design so that we can get to addressing all these ramifications and advancing soil health. So let me just put out some of the nearby fires, the things that we can solve in the next Farm Bill, and then I'd like to spend a little bit of time going into long-term. What are some of these big revolutionary changes and not just evolutionary changes? All right, so like I mentioned, conservation funding. Conservation funding represents about 6 or 7% of the Farm Bill. A very small portion, quite honestly. Secondly, it gets cut by appropriations every year. This is the one sector of the Farm Bill that can help solve and address all of these other unintended consequences, and yet we keep cutting it time and time again. This is a failure to look at the big picture. And then we have crop insurance. We have these rules, and I'm going to go through some of these. They're probably familiar to some, but there's also a lot of confusion out there. And also, here's just a fundamental issue when it comes to crop insurance. It is an annual contract. And so if I can, as I go into detailing how that plays out and how that has an impact on the adoption of soil health, let me provide a metaphor. Think of a typical land rental contract. You might have a landowner and a farmer who have had a relationship for 20 or 30 years. So it may be long-term, but each year is a separate contract. And that separation makes a distinct influence on how that land is managed. And it's the very same metaphor for crop insurance. These are separate individual annual contracts, but because of that separation, it gets played out in a particular way. All right, so let's talk about those near-term issues that we can resolve. So cover crops and crop insurance. So some of you have probably heard me say this or others talk about this. So these are the cover crop rules. So let me just make sure we're all on the same plane and we can go into some of these details. We've had a lot of rule changes over the last number of years. And this is always my beef, and I use cover crops, and I'm supremely frustrated by this. This is the only practice that has eligibility rules tied to it. So you mess up on your cover crops, you're just out. You mess up on anything else, your planting population, your seeding depth, how you manage weeds, anything else, well, we'll take a look at it and we'll make the adjustment on the loss. That's a big difference in message and outcome. And in particular, if we're looking and hoping to have farmers who are on the fence about cover crops and soil health jump in, this really doesn't help. We need to get this solved. I'm hopeful and I'm pretty certain that we will get this solved in the next Farm Bill. So I'm encouraged by that. So again, here's the background. How many of you have seen this map? You're familiar with this? Okay, this is a map created. These are part of the rules for the cover crops in crop insurance. Basically, it's when you have to terminate your cover crops. So I'm still looking, but I haven't found a similar map when it comes to when you till or when you plant, or what type of rotation you can use, can or cannot use. I just haven't seen it. So I'm still waiting for that from RMA. But I say that in jest. So this is reality here. So there's a little confusion here. Oftentimes, and I've heard this from crop insurance agents, I've heard this from farmers as well, that their agents aren't giving them all of the information. Again, anytime that there's confusion when it comes to this, what's somebody going to do if they're on the fence? They're going to go back to the status quo. Go to that safe area. And so this is, again, not helping. And again, because it's tied to eligibility. So there is a no-till bonus. So that map gets adjusted. You get more time to terminate if you're using no-till. Now, we haven't really fully defined no-till or how long you have to be in no-till. So again, uncertainty here, and it's not helping. There's also some uncertainty. I've heard a number of reports from farmers that their agent tells them that you just simply cannot plant into a cover crop, or you cannot plant a cover crop into an insured crop. And so again, we have confusion reigning in the system, and when there's confusion, everybody defaults to the status quo, your safe spot. Finally, this is not in there, but we've managed to get this in other language in other areas, and because it's not in the rules, it's not well advertised. You can't blame the cover crop because of bad weather. So if it's raining and you can't get out there to terminate, that's not the cover crop's fault. And that's not very well released out there. So what we have resulting is a bit of a confrontation between ensuring that we have this viable, useful risk management tool and ensuring that we have good soil health practices. So I wanted to point out, so Lee Breeze, he is the 2017 International Crop Consultant of the Year. He helps farmers in eastern North Dakota implement really good practices. This guy is just plain smart, and he's fun too. He's a pretty cool guy. He just puts it straight to his farmers. So let me just read this for everybody. Rules on federal crop insurance create some questions about the risk of planting cover crops and the impact on insured yields. And then you have the kicker. There are times, depending on a grower's risk-benefit process, where they're willing to sacrifice some of the safety net of crop insurance to do some of the management that is going to help them. That is a tough pill to swallow if you're in the crop insurance industry. And I hope that they see this, and see this in the best light possible. This is an opportunity to solve an impending problem that's coming down the road. This is an opportunity for them to do better, to make sure that their tool is maximizing its productivity and its service to farmers. And I think we can get there. First step, solving some of these rules. Let me shift a little bit here. There's a long-term strategy that can be had in crop insurance to help marriage up the crop insurance program to encouraging soil health. And I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago, and as I look out over some of the farmland in the area, and again, I use no-till and cover crops. My neighbors, it's a high tillage situation. I did not include the picture, and I should have done this. My neighbor, I did snap a photo of my neighbor driving down the road with his big John Deere 8630 tractor with his third piece of tillage equipment, which is a box scraper. And he literally pulls the soil from one area to the next in his fields because it's moving so much. And this is common. A lot of farmers have box scrapers in my area. So it's a little disconcerting. So I thought, and yet at the same time, I see them experiencing prevent plants situation year in and year out, or other challenges when it comes to maintaining stable yields. So in fact, what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is actually dig into the structure of crop insurance. And again, it goes back to the fact that it's an annual relationship, an annual contract. And it will look at, when it's making the decision about paying out on a claim if there's a yield loss, it will look at what has happened in that one growing year for that year. Anything that happens before that is off the table. Well, we all know that there are decisions that we can make and practices we can implement that can over time reduce our risk to various issues. And so fundamentally, the crop insurance program fails to consider, to value some of those long-term risk mitigating behaviors. And so I'm going to turn this around and let's take a look at some of those long-term risks that are in fact essentially ignored in the crop insurance program. And at the same time, because they're ignored, they get the payouts, and the guys that are taking care of these issues are not rewarded adequately in their pricing structure. Like I said, I look around at my neighbors often. So this is back in 2014. My no-till, cover-cropped, 3-crop rotation field on your right. My neighbors, literally across the road. He had soybeans that year as well. I want you to notice too that we had much different, not just in the picture here, but the context here. I was able to combine those beans and get a good yield 3 days after an 1.5 inch rain. Got out there, that's what my field looked like. My neighbor, he was a week later, he had a 1/2 inch rain, combined 3 days later, and that's what his field looked like. All right, so in this relationship, in crop insurance, he probably didn't experience a yield loss. And so nothing would show up in that relationship with crop insurance. But then the next year comes, right? And the year after that. And so he is at a fundamental, he's already at a disadvantage and at a less likely chance of reaching his average yield because of that event. And so we need to find a way to consider compaction in the crop insurance program. All right, another region and another issue here, salinity. So those of you in the Dakotas and Montana, maybe even Nebraska or Minnesota, you're familiar with this issue. So you have a high water table. There's a lot of salt in that soil. And what happens is that sometimes that water table will get up to the surface and you have evaporation. The water leaves, but the salt doesn't. And then you get areas in your field that look like this. Nothing will grow. It's estimated in Montana alone we have over 300,000 acres of cropland that has been abandoned because of salinity. So it's significant. But it's not just an on or off issue. There's a lot of area in between here. What about in those years where it's building up and it's slowly getting there before you have to abandon? They too are experiencing significant yield declines, up to 50% yield loss those years. Now you can't necessarily attribute that to any one particular year or any one particular practice. Instead, it is a combination and the buildup over years and over time. A lot of people say the cause is, again, high water table and evaporation. Okay, well, what if part of the cause is ourselves and our decisions that we make that make us more susceptible to high water table and high salt issues? Two big causes to having salinity: tillage and short crop rotations with short season crops. There's a reason why we're starting to see this issue crop up in the Dakotas and Montana as the corn and bean rotation creeps into that area. To be totally truthful and honest, I don't necessarily, as a farmer, I don't think it's fair of us to require crop insurance companies to cover some of these claims. I don't think that's part of the relationship. Some simple solutions here. And this is like, right, I'm preaching to the choir here. Crop rotations, no-till and cover crops. If you can transpire that excess moisture through a plant, you actually help pull those salts back down into the soil. It's a big difference. It's a big thing. It's a little thing, but it's a big thing, right? Evaporation from the soil surface versus transpiration from plant matter, and it matters a lot. All right, I'm going to give you another example here. We've got prevent plant that happens pretty regularly. So, all right, so that's in your, let's say that's first crop year. You had a prevent plant. Now you have a decision to make. You can either, as a farmer, you can either till it or chemically make sure that no weeds grow up on there too much, and then you start over the next crop year. Okay, no big deal, right? Here's the problem. This research shows, side by side, that if you have a prevent plant or a flooded situation, the following crop year, if you plant a cover crop during that prevent plant year, your yields go up 15% the year after. So again, we've got a separate year, and yet because of these distinct yearly relationships, it's not considered. It's not part of the equation. All right, I want to give you this slide. There's a lot going on here, but I want you to think about is looking at the big pieces. It's really about the two of the three big pieces here. So if I could, the big blue piece on your left is these are crop insurance claims from 2015. So the big piece, the big blue piece of the pie on your left, excess moisture, precipitation, and rain. And the gray piece is drought. The other third big piece is pricing. Well, we can't do anything about pricing and declines in price. But we're talking about 28% and 19% of all crop insurance losses. 47% total of all crop insurance claims are related to moisture management. Okay, there's got to be something there, right? This is it right here. Excess moisture or not enough moisture. Simply put, soil organic matter infiltration rates, maintaining percolation makes a significant difference when it comes to minimizing your loss and your risk related to excess or not enough moisture. So any practices that encourage soil organic matter, that's going to help hold on to moisture. Any practices that encourage infiltration, again, that's going to help not only in maintaining adequate moisture, but also maintaining adequate air and gas exchange throughout the soil profile and draining away excess moisture. So these are significant. And again, you cannot necessarily tie them to any one particular year. But you can start looking at practices over the long term that have an impact. Here's another one of my neighbors. We are baling up our soybean residue because it sells for $20 a bale. Soybean residue, yeah, you heard me correct. Soybean residue, right? So you only get, a couple bales out of the acre. That is, soybeans, in any given soybean year, you're already just barely breaking even on your soil organic matter budget, right? And now we're really losing it. And then we go and we till it up even further because apparently we can't plant into what's left of the soybean residue. Again, sometimes it's fascinating where I farm. Tillage and removing residue, these are the two biggest significant components to reducing soil organic matter and reducing your drainage and infiltration. And yet, it doesn't really enter into the equation. Baling up soybean residue, that's, in that contract year of those soybeans, you already harvested your soybeans. I don't care what, as a crop insurance company, I don't care what happens later, right? All right, I'm going to go through one more here and then I'll be able to wrap it up. So monoculture or crop rotation. So this is a study done out of Canada, and those poor Canadians, they just don't get enough respect down here. They're like the Rodney Dangerfield of North America, just get no respect. Let me just cut to the chase on this. This is really an insightful article. I suggest if you're interested in it, look it up. Just a lot of great insight, but let me just, like I said, cut to the chase on this. Here are their insights. Over 31 years of data that they gathered looking at different crop rotations and tillage management, looking at not just average yield, but also yield variability, and that's the big one. All right, continuous corn and corn bean had the highest chance of lowest yields. Okay, point number 2. Tillage widened the yield curve, and I'm going to talk about the yield curve. But essentially, higher highs and lower lowers. same average, but just spread out. Your distribution of yield in any chance, any given year, gets wider. And I'm going to talk about the significance in crop insurance with that. And finally, in challenging weather, so they qualified challenging weather as hot and dry and cool and wet. In those seasons, a rotation benefit increased yields by 16%. So these are significant because here's the fundamental component of the crop insurance and how this operates. This is a simple yield distribution. The assumption is that dotted line down the middle is your average yield. That is part of what determines how much guarantee you receive. It also determines how much risk we evaluate each individual farmer within a county. The assumption right now is that all farmers in a county essentially share the same blue curve, right? That we all have an equal chance at a low yield as a high yield, and that we have an equal chance of getting yields in those tails. So the tails are the low parts on both sides. In crop insurance, tails are bad. And I'll give you two reasons why. So one, on the left-hand side, that's your low yield years. You get a yield in a low yield year, that's going to result in a payout, right? So the bigger that left-sided tail, that's the bigger the chance of having a low yield. And at the same time, the right-sided yield, which is a chance for a really high bin buster yield, it increases, which one at first blush would say, that's good, right? When it comes to crop insurance, it's a non-payout year. Yeah, but having such a high yield year and having such yield variability where you have a pretty good chance at low or extremely low or extremely high, that bends the average. That really high number, that 300 yield per acre year, that brought your average way up. So what that does for a crop insurance company, and you tell me if this is fair to them, that now that average is up, they have to start paying out more frequently on the lower years. This is my suggestion here. If we got more accurate on our risk rating by considering some of these practices in terms of risk and yield variability, we would start getting and producing different yield curves. My suggestion here is that soil health is the red yield curve. Very small tails, high incidence, high opportunity for yields right around the average. If I'm a crop insurer, I want that guy. That's my guy, and I'm going to look for them every time. If you're not using soil health, your yield curve looks like the green. There's a lot of area on the low yield. That means there's a high number of years where they're paying out. Everybody's got the same average, but yet the distribution is significant. Let me just make a side note, and then I'm going to talk about some conclusions of where we can go with all of this. So everybody's probably heard about Iowa. They've got this crop insurance program. They're going to provide a little additional subsidy. I'm encouraged by this because this is going to allow us to capture a lot of data on what that does for that yield distribution curve. I hope some other states do it because that data is going to be significant. All right, so my just three closing conclusions here. We need to consider the ramifications of policies. We need to start looking at how we as taxpayers spend all of our dollars. Secondly, I hope everybody's picked up, especially in the second half of this presentation, that we need to start considering in crop insurance a long-term contract or a long-term relationship. And in that allows us to consider the long-term ramifications of practices. If we get to that point, soil health will get valued. Farmers who are using soil health, their premiums will go way down, and those who are not, your premiums are going to go up. It's the power of averages that puts us all in the same pool, and then that's a disincentive to use soil health. Thirdly, we need the data. We need to get the data to show it because we've got plenty of stories. I've experienced it. I know other farmers have experienced this. I know it's out there, but we need to have a lot more data out there. So I think that's going to help us evolve to where we need to be so that we have soil health across the landscape. So do we have time for questions or take it at the end? All right, well, thank you for listening. I appreciate your time.